In the 21st century, while many of us enjoy the freedom to express our beliefs and follow any spiritual path we choose, there are dark places on our planet where a simple book is considered a dangerous weapon, a subversive object capable of shaking the foundations of totalitarian regimes and radical theocracies. The Bible, a text that has shaped civilizations and inspired millions over the centuries, has become, for some, a forbidden object whose mere possession can result in imprisonment, torture, and even death. From the strict laws of the Saudi theocracy to the ruthless persecutions of the North Korean regime, from concentration camps to summary executions, the path of faith becomes a journey of constant danger for those who refuse to abandon their deepest convictions. But what drives governments and regimes to fear an ancient book so much? And more importantly, what does this persistence of faith reveal to us about the human condition, even in the face of the most brutal repressions? In the heart of East Asia, there is a country isolated from the world, not only by its hermetically sealed borders, but by an ideological system that represses any divergent thinking. North Korea, ruled by the Kim dynasty since 1948, represents the most extreme example of religious persecution on our planet. In this totalitarian regime, where the supreme leader is worshipped as a deity, any form of worship that is not directed towards the state is considered an unforgivable betrayal. Can you imagine a place where owning a Bible is considered a more serious offense than many murders? Jewish ideology, the country's official philosophical system, demands absolute devotion to the supreme leader. Any suggestion that there is a higher authority, such as God, represents a direct threat to the legitimacy of the regime. For this reason, Christianity is seen not only as a foreign religion, but as a dangerously subversive ideology that must be eradicated at any cost. The North Korean authorities have installed a surveillance system so invasive that even in the most intimate relationships, between parents and children, there is constant fear of snitching. North Korean Christians live in the shadows, practicing their faith in absolute secrecy. Many have never seen a physical Bible, only fragments memorized and passed down orally from generation to generation, like precious poems that cannot be written down. Some testimonies reveal that believers gather in tiny groups, often members of the same family, whispering prayers under blankets to muffle the sound. Think about it. In a world of smartphones and the internet, there are people who risk their lives to mutter Bible verses that they only remember. The consequences for those who are discovered are unimaginable for those who live in free societies. The infamous Kwanliso, the regime's concentration camps, house thousands of political prisoners, many of them Christians. These camps are not just detention facilities, but veritable centers of slow extermination, where prisoners face forced labor, systematic starvation, daily torture, and public executions. Documents and testimonies reveal that entire families, including children and the elderly, are sent to these camps when a single member is caught with a Bible. There are documented accounts of Christians executed by particularly cruel methods, some crucified, others burnt alive in industrial ovens, all to serve as a deterrent. A North Korean defector, whose name is being kept secret for security reasons, testified that she saw her neighbor publicly executed after authorities found a small Bible hidden in the basement of her house. In her testimony, she described how the woman was beaten violently before being shot, while her family was forced to watch. And can you understand what that means? It's not just one person who dies, but an entire community traumatized by terror. The country's hermetically sealed borders make it difficult not only for humanitarian aid to enter, but also for religious materials. International Christian organizations have developed creative methods to get Bibles into the country, from GPS balloons that drop small waterproof Bibles over rural areas to tiny digital devices containing biblical texts. For the few who manage to access these materials, each page represents a treasure of incalculable value, often divided between several believers, who memorize different chapters to preserve the content in case the physical material is discovered. The control over information is so strict that many North Koreans grow up without even knowing the concept of God or religion. The country's education system teaches that Christianity is a Western imperialist tool to destroy the purity of the nation. State propaganda portrays missionaries and Christians as demons who kidnap children and extract their organs. This systematic demonization aims not only to prevent conversions, but also to encourage the population to report any suspicious activity. Who could keep their faith in an environment where even their own children could denounce them after being indoctrinated at school? The persecution of North Korean Christians didn't start with the current regime. Historically, the Korean peninsula has had a significant Christian presence, especially in the north, where Pyongyang was known as the Jerusalem of the East due to the large number of churches. With the division of the peninsula after the Second World War and the subsequent Civil War, the communist regime began a systematic purge against religious leaders and believers. Over the decades, this persecution has only intensified, turning what was once a vibrant community into an underground church that struggles daily to survive. Researchers and human rights organizations estimate that between 50,000 and 70,000 Christians are currently being held in North Korean concentration camps. However, these figures are approximate, as it is practically impossible to obtain precise statistics from such a closed country. And what is most impressive, despite this brutal persecution, Christianity has not been eradicated. In conditions that defy human comprehension, the faith persists, transmitted in whispers, kept alive by those who know that confessing Christ could mean their death sentence. The case of North Korea confronts us with a deeply uncomfortable question. How would we react if our faith cost us everything? While many of us take religious freedom for granted, rarely attending services or reading the scriptures available on our bookshelves, there are brothers and sisters who sacrifice their safety, freedom, and even their lives for the right to know and practice their faith. The testimony of these persecuted Christians is not only a cry for justice, but a call to reevaluate the value we place on the freedoms we possess and often neglect. In the heart of the Arabian Peninsula stand the minarets of the mosques most sacred to Muslims the world over. Saudi Arabia, guardian of Mecca and Medina, is not just an oil-rich kingdom, but the spiritual epicenter of one of the largest religions on the planet. In this country, where the endless desert meets the architectural modernity of futuristic cities, a dark reality hides behind the glittering facade: the total suppression of any religious expression other than Wahhabi Islam. Can you imagine living in a place where the simple act of making the sign of the cross can result in imprisonment? Wahhabism, the ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam that dominates the Saudi kingdom, does not recognize the right to religious freedom. For the Saudi authorities, there is no such thing as pluralism, only the absolute truth of their doctrine. The country's constitution is explicit. The Quran is the only fundamental law, and any non-Islamic religious practice is forbidden on Saudi soil. This fundamentalist rigor permeates all spheres of public and private life, from education to the judicial system, creating an environment where religious diversity is seen as a threat to national identity itself. The Saudi religious police, known as the Mutawa, Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, tirelessly patrol streets, shopping centers, and public spaces in search of violations of strict Islamic morality. With the authority to detain, interrogate, and punish, these moral watchdogs turn into real infidel hunters when they suspect clandestine Christian activities. They search private homes, inspect mobile phones, and monitor suspicious meetings. With a simple anonymous tip-off, a Christian's life can fall apart in a matter of hours. What would it mean for you to live knowing that at any moment your door could be broken down and your privacy invaded because of your faith? For the millions of Christian expatriate workers in Saudi Arabia, Filipinos, Indians, Ethiopians, and so many others who make up the kingdom's invisible workforce, religious life is a constant tension between spiritual need and the instinct for survival. Officially, foreigners can practice their faith privately, but this concession is illusory. Any gathering of more than a few people is considered an illegal church, and the definition of private is deliberately nebulous. Christian domestic workers report how they have to hide small crucifixes in sock drawers, and how they pray locked in bathrooms with the taps running to mask the sound of their prayers. The consequences for those found with Christian material are severe and disproportionate. For Saudi citizens who convert to Christianity, considered apostates, the legal penalty can be execution, although in practice many disappear into prisons without a formal trial. Foreigners caught with Bibles face immediate deportation, often after periods of detention during which they are subjected to humiliating interrogations and sometimes physical abuse. The authorities methodically confiscate any religious material found, from crucifixes and rosaries to electronic devices containing biblical texts. How would you feel having to memorize Bible verses because owning the physical book is too risky? A particularly moving testimony is that of Maria, a Filipino nurse who worked for 7 years in Riyadh. In her small maid's room, she kept a Bible hidden inside a shoebox, buried under clothes at the back of the wardrobe. On Friday evenings, her only day off, she organized discreet prayer meetings with 4 other Christian nurses, always with someone watching the door. They sang hymns in barely audible whispers, fearing denunciations from the neighbors. One morning, the religious police raided the building following a tip-off. Maria managed to swallow the small page of the gospel she was reading at the time, but her friend was caught with a rosary in her hands. Deported within 48 hours, this friend lost 5 years of accumulated wages that she had hoped to send to her family in the Philippines. Modern technology, ironically, has become both a blessing and a curse for Saudi Christians. On the one hand, disguised Bible apps and encrypted social networks allow access to scriptures and virtual fellowship. On the other, the government's sophisticated digital surveillance monitors suspicious communications, and being caught with digital religious content can be just as dangerous as possessing a physical Bible. One Saudi convert described how he uses coded language in his communications. Jesus becomes the doctor, church becomes clinic, and Bible is referred to as the health manual. This kind of linguistic subterfuge is the daily reality for those who want to keep their faith alive under constant surveillance. The glaring contradiction between Saudi Arabia's economic modernization and its medieval treatment of religious freedoms reveals the deep tensions of a country torn between global aspirations and entrenched traditions. The kingdom spends billions on international public relations, futuristic projects like AOM, a $500 billion city under construction, and global sporting events, seeking to project an image of progressivism. At the same time, it maintains one of the most repressive systems in the world in terms of fundamental freedoms. What does it say about our world order that democratic nations applaud superficial reforms while turning a blind eye to systematic violations of basic human rights? International human rights organizations have documented how Christians are systematically excluded from government jobs, discriminated against in the judicial system, and subjected to constant harassment. In 2011, the case of Fahad al-Shamri shocked the international community when this Saudi businessman was arrested after being denounced by a domestic worker who found a small crucifix in his drawer. Subjected to 90 days of interrogation, he was finally released only after publicly renouncing Christianity and reaffirming his Islamic faith on a national television program. His case illustrates how even privileged citizens are not immune when it comes to religious apostasy. The question that echoes across the sands of the Saudi desert is, how does a faith survive when everything conspires to eliminate it? The answer lies in the extraordinary human resilience and deeply personal nature of religious experience. Saudi and expatriate Christians continue to find creative ways to nurture their faith, whether through virtual communities, coded literature, or simple moments of quiet contemplation. Every prayer whispered in a closed room, every verse memorized, every risk taken to share their faith with a trusted friend becomes an act of peaceful resistance against a system that seeks to control not only external actions, but also internal convictions. And isn't it this ability to maintain hope even in the most adverse circumstances that ultimately defines the essence of religious experience? Crystal clear waters of an impossible turquoise blue, bungalows on stilts jutting out over serene lagoons, and luxurious resorts that promise escapism and total relaxation. The Maldives, an archipelago of 1,192 islands in the Indian Ocean, is sold to the world as the ultimate paradise on Earth, a dream destination for honeymoons and extravagant holidays. However, behind the idyllic facade marketed in travel magazines lurks one of the most religiously restrictive societies on the planet. Can you imagine that in the same place where tourists enjoy absolute freedom, the locals live under constant surveillance of their faith? The Maldivian constitution is unequivocal in its 9th article. A non-Muslim cannot become a citizen of the Maldives. The country not only establishes Islam as the official religion, but makes Muslim identity a prerequisite for citizenship itself. All laws must conform to Sharia principles, and any liberal or progressive interpretation of Islam is strongly discouraged. The Ministry of Islamic Affairs strictly supervises all aspects of religious practice, and apostasy, renouncing Islam, is not only illegal, but punishable by loss of citizenship and, in extreme cases, can lead to the death penalty, although this is rarely formally applied. The Maldivian authorities obsessively monitor borders and harbors to prevent the entry of offensive religious materials, a category that includes Bibles, crucifixes, Buddha statues, and any non-Islamic symbols. For the rare Maldivian citizens who secretly embrace Christianity, life is a constant exercise in dissimulation and fear. They continue to attend mosques to avoid suspicion, participate in Islamic rituals publicly, and never reveal their true faith, even to their closest relatives. Conversion rarely occurs through direct contact with missionaries, who are banned in the country, but often through experiences abroad or discreet contact with Christian material online. One convert described his life as a constant and necessary lie, explaining, I openly pray Islamic prayers 5 times a day, but when I'm alone, I close my eyes and pray to the Christ I've discovered. What would it be like to live torn between two identities, fearing that a simple verbal slip could trigger a personal catastrophe? The consequences of being identified as a Christian in the Maldives are catastrophic and multidimensional. On a legal level, the person faces imprisonment, intensive interrogation, and possible physical abuse. However, it is the social dimension of the punishment that is perhaps even more devastating. In a small, interconnected society, where the inhabited islands have extremely close-knit communities, social ostracism is tantamount to civil death. Converts who are discovered are immediately rejected by their families, lose their jobs, are expelled from their homes, and become outcasts in their own land. Forcibly divorced from their spouses and prevented from seeing their children, they face such intense psychological pressure that many end up publicly renouncing their Christian faith, at least outwardly, just to regain some semblance of a normal life. The social surveillance system in the Maldives is extraordinarily effective precisely because it is informal and omnipresent. Neighbors monitor neighbors, colleagues observe colleagues, and even children are encouraged to report un-Islamic behavior. One secret Christian recounted how he had to repeatedly check his house for incriminating items before allowing even an air conditioning technician to enter. Another described how he changed his internet browsing habits, always deleting his history and using virtual private networks, VPNs, after hearing about an acquaintance who was reported for viewing a Christian website in an internet cafe. Who can measure the psychological cost of living under such constant surveillance, where even the pattern of clicks on your computer can have disastrous consequences? Ibrahim, fictitious name for protection, was a university lecturer in Malé, the densely populated capital of the archipelago. After traveling to Singapore for an academic conference, he returned with a new spiritual perspective, having secretly attended a Christian service during his stay. His growing interest led him to discreetly download biblical texts on his phone. For months, he studied clandestinely, waking up before dawn to read the scriptures before the obligatory Islamic prayers. His double life worked until a colleague, using his computer for a presentation, noticed a suspiciously named file. Reported to the authorities, Ibrahim was detained for 3 weeks, during which he suffered intense psychological pressure. When he was finally released, he had lost his job, his wife had started divorce proceedings, and his own mother refused to speak to him. Today, he lives in internal exile, working in temporary, unskilled jobs, under constant monitoring by the authorities. In a country where owning a physical Bible is practically impossible, Maldivian Christians resort to extraordinarily creative methods to access the scriptures. Some memorize entire passages during trips abroad, becoming living Bibles, who can share the sacred texts orally with other believers. Others use tiny SD cards or encrypted USB drives that can be easily hidden or destroyed in the event of a search. Bible apps are disguised as games or utility tools, and text files are stored under misleading names. One convert described how he wrote Bible verses on the back of decorative wallpaper in his home, literally hiding the Word of God in plain sight. These spiritual survival strategies reveal not only ingenuity, but a deep hunger for the truth that no ban can extinguish. Religious intolerance in the Maldives is particularly ironic when we consider the archipelago's history. Before the conversion to Islam in the 12th century, the islands were influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism, as evidenced by archaeological artifacts discovered over the years, statues of Buddha and Hindu symbols that the current government tends to downplay or hide. For centuries, the Maldives practiced a syncretic and relatively tolerant version of Islam, incorporating elements of its pre-Islamic traditions. It is only in recent decades, with the growing influence of Islamic extremism and funding from Wahhabi currents, that the country has adopted increasingly rigid interpretations. This radical change illustrates how religious intolerance is often not the result of ancient traditions, but of modern political manipulations of religious identity. The international community maintains an embarrassing silence on the situation of religious rights in the Maldives, largely due to the economic importance of tourism, which generates approximately 28% of the country's GDP. Travelogues rarely mention that while tourists enjoy considerable freedom within the resorts, including the consumption of alcohol and private religious practices, the same rights are categorically denied to local citizens. Human rights organizations estimate that there are only a few hundred Maldivian Christians, living in absolute secrecy and with little or no contact with each other. With a population of less than 400,000 people spread across geographically isolated islands, the small Christian community faces immense logistical challenges to maintain any semblance of fellowship or collective practice. The situation in the Maldives raises profound questions about the meaning of freedom in our globalized world. How can we reconcile a nation's right to cultural sovereignty with universal human rights? The paradox of a country that builds its economy by welcoming foreigners of all religions while denying religious freedom to its own citizens exposes the contradictions of our international order. How many of the millions of tourists who visit the islands every year are aware that their boat driver or hotel attendant could be arrested simply for possessing the same holy book that they freely have in their homes? The persistence of the Christian faith in the Maldives, against all odds, testifies to something deeply significant about the nature of human belief. When people are willing to risk everything, family, job, freedom, and even their lives, for a faith they can never publicly express, they challenge our materialistic understanding of the world. One Maldivian convert, writing anonymously, expressed, "My faith is like a precious pearl that I keep hidden at the bottom of the ocean. No one can see it, but its value to me is greater than anything else in the world." This metaphor, so appropriate for an island nation, captures the essence of spirituality under persecution, invisible externally, but of incalculable value internally. And isn't it this ability to find meaning beyond external circumstances that forms the core not only of religion, but of human resilience itself? In the Horn of Africa, bathed by the Indian Ocean, Somalia stands as a tragic monument to the devastating effects of civil war, religious extremism, and state collapse. A country fragmented by decades of conflict, where warlords, Islamist militias, and a fragile government vie for territory and power, Somalia has become one of the most dangerous places on the planet for anyone, but especially for Christians. In a nation where chaos has become the norm, where violence is the common language, and where lawlessness is the only consistent law, religious persecution takes on particularly brutal and relentless forms. Can you imagine a place where being identified as a Christian means not only imprisonment, but often summary execution without any legal process? Since the collapse of the central government in 1991, Somalia has become fertile ground for the growth of Islamic extremist groups, the most notorious being Al-Shabaab, the Youth, a terrorist organization affiliated with Al-Qaeda. Controlling vast areas of the south and center of the country, Al-Shabaab imposes an extremely strict interpretation of Sharia law, publicly executing people accused of espionage, apostasy, or simply for not conforming to its religious codes. For this group, Christianity is not just a different religion, but a tool of the West to corrupt Somali society and an existential threat that must be eradicated with extreme violence. The organization has openly declared its intention to cleanse the country of any Christian presence, a campaign they implement with terrifying methodology and brutal efficiency. For Somali Christians, estimated at just a few thousand in a predominantly Muslim population of 16 million, life is an experience of constant terror. Virtually all are converts from Islam, since historic Christianity has been effectively eliminated from the country. Their conversion is kept an absolute secret, often hidden even from spouses and children. The suspicion of conversion to Christianity is enough to trigger extreme violence not only from the militias, but often from the family itself, which considers apostasy an intolerable stain on the honor of the clan. One Somali convert described his existence as living with a death sentence hanging over my head every minute of every day. What kind of faith can survive under such relentless pressure, where expressing your deepest belief can result in beheading? Al-Shabaab's executions of Christians are often filmed and distributed as propaganda, public displays of power designed to terrorize anyone contemplating conversion. The methods are deliberately medieval and spectacularized: public beheadings, crucifixions, stonings to death. In 2008, a 13-year-old girl, Aisha Ibrahim Duhilo, was publicly stoned to death in Kismayo after being accused of converting to Christianity, despite her desperate denials. In 2021, Suleiman Abduwahab, an English teacher who had returned from Ethiopia, was beheaded in front of villagers forcibly rounded up after militants found Christian materials on his computer. These are not isolated cases, but examples of a systematic campaign of religious terror that takes place far from the cameras of the international media and therefore rarely receives global attention. The collective trauma inflicted on Somali Christians extends far beyond public executions. Christian women face systematic sexual violence, often sold as wives to militants or raped as a form of collective punishment. Christian children are kidnapped and forced to attend extremist madrasas, where they are indoctrinated against their parents' faith. Houses and property belonging to suspected Christians are confiscated or burned. Al-Shabaab maintains an extensive network of informers, offering substantial rewards for reporting Christian activities. In areas under their control, religious inspectors, mutasabin, carry out random searches of homes looking for evidence of apostasy, including Bibles, crosses, or simply suspicious notes. This claustrophobic atmosphere of surveillance turns even the most private spaces into danger zones, where a Bible verse written on a piece of paper can mean a death sentence. Hassan, name changed for safety, was a successful businessman in Mogadishu when, during a business trip to Kenya, he learned about Christianity through a work colleague. Fascinated by Jesus' teachings on forgiveness, a profoundly impactful concept for someone brought up in a society divided by endless cycles of tribal revenge, he began to secretly explore the Christian faith. For almost 2 years, he kept his new faith completely hidden, reading Bible passages on his phone only offline and in airplane mode, deleting them immediately after reading them. His double life came to an abrupt end when his cousin, who used his phone to make a call, noticed a Bible app hidden in a folder that appeared to be for games. Hassan's family carried out a forced intervention, confiscating his passport and confining him at home while local religious leaders tried to cleanse him of Christian influence. After weeks of psychological pressure and explicit threats, Hassan pretended to return to Islam. At the first opportunity, he fled to Kenya, abandoning his business, his home, and his extended family. Today, he lives as a refugee in Nairobi, unable to return to his home country on pain of death. The situation of Somali Christians is aggravated by the country's extremely complex political context. Somalia is technically a federal republic, but the central government effectively controls only parts of the capital and a few other cities, relying heavily on African Union peacekeepers for its security. The interim constitution declares Islam as the official religion and Sharia law as the fundamental source of legislation. Although it theoretically guarantees religious freedom, the reality is that the government is unable to protect religious minorities even in the areas under its nominal control. Government officials, fearing being labeled as un-Islamic or Western collaborators, often refrain from defending persecuted Christians. In a country where tribal loyalties often trump national identity and where religious extremism has become a political tool, Christians find themselves without legal, social, or physical protection. The Somali Christian community, fragmented and underground, has developed extraordinary survival strategies. Without physical churches or visible leadership, believers organize themselves into tiny cells of 3 or 4 people, rarely knowing more than their own group. Physical Bibles are extraordinarily rare. Many Somali Christians have never seen one. Instead, they memorize orally transmitted passages or access digital texts briefly before deleting them. Communion, a central element of Christian practice, is reimagined in creative contexts, i.e. business meeting, a casual encounter on the beach, or coded conversations via encrypted apps. To disguise their faith, many continue to attend mosques and perform Islamic prayers publicly, while secretly praying to Christ in their hearts. This schizophrenic existence, outwardly Muslim, inwardly Christian, creates deep psychological and spiritual conflicts. How can the authenticity of faith be preserved when every aspect of religious expression must be carefully masked? International Christian organizations face immense challenges in supporting Somali believers. Material or spiritual aid must be channeled through extraordinarily discreet networks, as any identifiable connection with foreign Christian organizations is seen as evidence of Western espionage. Foreign missionaries are priority targets for kidnapping and execution by Al-Shabaab, as demonstrated by the 2009 case when 4 Christian aid workers were beheaded in Merka for spreading Christianity. The few Christian radio programs in the Somali language, broadcast from neighboring countries, are often the only source of biblical teaching for isolated believers. These programs use carefully coded language and avoid explicit Christian terminology, referring for example to Jesus as the Honored One and to God as the Protector, terminology acceptable in the Islamic context but recognizable to Christian listeners. The Somali tragedy raises deeply disturbing questions about the silence of the international community. While the country's humanitarian crisis, famine, displacement, armed conflict, receives intermittent attention, systematic religious cleansing goes largely unnoticed in international forums. This omission partly reflects pragmatic concerns. Highlighting religious persecution could complicate humanitarian operations in regions controlled by extremists. But it also reveals an implicit hierarchy of concerns, where suffering based on religious identity is given less urgency than other forms of violence. For the Somali Christian facing beheading for his faith, this diplomatic distinction offers little comfort. How do we balance the need for humanitarian assistance with the moral imperative to confront systematic religious persecution? Despite this bleak outlook, signs of hope emerge from Somali Christian stories of extraordinary resilience. Many report that persecution, far from destroying their faith, has deepened it in ways that would be impossible in safer environments. One Somali refugee in Uganda expressed, "When every prayer can be your last, you learn to pray with an intensity that many free Christians will never know." Others describe deeply spiritual experiences, visions, dreams, intense sensations of divine peace that sustain them through almost unbearable trauma. These accounts of inner transformation in the midst of external terror challenge our secular understanding of suffering, suggesting dimensions of human experience that transcend purely materialistic explanations. What can we learn from those who, in the most extreme circumstances, discover not only how to survive, but how to find meaning and even joy in their underground faith? In the heart of Central Asia, surrounded by imposing mountains and deep valleys, Afghanistan bears the scars of decades of war, foreign occupation, and internal conflict. This country, nicknamed the Graveyard of Empires for its historic resistance to invaders, has also become the graveyard of hope for many who yearn for religious freedom. With the Taliban's return to power in August 2021, after the withdrawal of American forces, the already fragile space for non-Islamic religious expression has completely disappeared. What does it mean to live in a country where, overnight, your spiritual identity has become not only illegal, but punishable by death? The Taliban, whose name means students in Pashto, originally emerged in the 1990s as a movement of religious students trained in Pakistan's extremely conservative madrasas, Islamic schools. His first period in power, 1996 to 2001, was marked by the implementation of one of the strictest interpretations of Sharia ever seen in the modern world, with sweeping bans that included music, television, female education, and any non-Islamic religious expression. After its fall in 2001, a fragile religious freedom emerged in parts of the country, allowing a small Afghan Christian community to begin to form, mainly of converts from Islam. This window of relative tolerance closed violently with the group's return to control of Kabul, initiating what many observers describe as a witch hunt against anyone suspected of abandoning Islam. Under the current Taliban regime, apostasy, abandoning Islam, is considered one of the most serious crimes possible, punishable by execution. Sharia law, implemented in its strictest form, does not recognize the right of Muslims to convert to another religion, considering such an act a betrayal not only of the faith, but of Afghan national identity itself. The number of Christians in Afghanistan, already tiny before the Taliban took over the country, has fallen dramatically since August 2021, with thousands fleeing to neighboring countries such as Pakistan, Iran, and Tajikistan. Those who remain, an estimated 8,000 to 12,000 people, live in a permanent state of terror, knowing that their discovery would mean almost certain torture and execution. Can you imagine the psychological weight of carrying a secret that, if revealed, would condemn not only you, but potentially your entire family? The case of Hamid, name changed for safety, exemplifies the terror faced by Afghan Christians after the fall of Kabul. A university professor who had converted to Christianity during his studies abroad, Hamid kept his faith a secret for years, sharing it only with his wife. When the Taliban regained power, fighters from the group gained access to government records, including lists of people who had studied in Western countries and were considered contaminated by foreign influences. Alerted by a former colleague that his name was on a list of suspects, Hamid immediately burnt any Christian material he possessed, including handwritten Bible study notes hidden in the lining of his mattress. For 3 weeks, he and his family lived in hiding in a basement, changing location repeatedly while Taliban fighters visited their former home multiple times. Eventually, with the help of international Christian contacts, they managed to cross the border into Pakistan, abandoning all their belongings and their previous life. Today, as undocumented refugees, they face discrimination and constant precariousness, but Hamid says, "I lost my home, my career, and my country, but I preserved my soul." In today's Afghanistan, owning a Bible, whether in physical or digital format, represents one of the greatest possible risks for a Christian. Taliban forces carry out frequent house searches, ostensibly looking for weapons or connections to the former government, but with specific instructions to identify heretical religious material. When the Taliban took power, many Afghan Christians were forced to make devastating decisions, burning Bibles they had preserved and hidden for years, sometimes the only copies available in their local dialects. Others buried their Bibles in remote locations, marked only by mental references. A convert from Herat described how she dismantled her only Bible, distributing different portions between 5 different locations on her rural property, so that the discovery of one part would not reveal the whole. Every time I want to read the word, I have to put the pieces together like a jigsaw puzzle and then take them apart again, she explained. It's as if the Bible itself lives like us, fragmented and hidden, but still alive. Technological surveillance has dramatically intensified the risks for Afghan Christians. The Taliban, contrary to its image as an anti-technology movement, has implemented sophisticated digital monitoring systems, partly inherited from the previous government and partly provided by international allies. Taliban fighters routinely inspect mobile phones at checkpoints, looking for biblical apps, contacts with Christian organizations, or messages containing Christian terminology. Many converts have been exposed through their digital communications, when confiscated smartphones revealed histories of compromising conversations. This threat has forced the Christian community to develop complex coded communication systems, where apparently innocent terms replace Christian language: the doctor, Jesus; the clinic, house church; medicines, Christian literature. Even so, the fear of surveillance is so intense that many Afghan Christians choose to isolate themselves completely, avoiding any contact with other believers and practicing their faith in absolute solitude. How can you keep a fundamentally communal faith alive when meeting with other believers can mean death? Christian women in Afghanistan face a double vulnerability, oppressed by both their faith and their gender. The return of the Taliban has reimposed severe restrictions on women, excluding them from secondary and higher education, banning them from working in most sectors, and imposing the wearing of the full burqa in public. For female converts, these restrictions create almost total isolation, eliminating any space where they could potentially meet other believers. Muslim families obsessively monitor their women's movements, making it virtually impossible for secret converts to take part in any clandestine Christian activity. One convert from Mazar-i-Sharif shared how her only connection with other Christians was through a tiny radio hidden under her mattress, tuned to extremely low frequencies to pick up Christian broadcasts from outside. During the 5 daily Islamic prayers, when everyone is busy, I can listen for a few minutes to the word that feeds my soul, she explained. It's my only sanctuary. For these women, the Christian faith represents not only a spiritual path, but an affirmation of their human dignity and individual worth in a system that systematically denies them. The situation of Afghan Christians is aggravated by the inaction of the international community. During the chaotic withdrawal of Western forces in 2021, evacuation priority was mainly given to direct collaborators of the military and foreign governments, leaving many known and documented Christians behind. With a few notable exceptions, such as specific programs implemented by Italy, Brazil, and some Nordic countries, most Western nations have been reluctant to explicitly recognize Christian converts as a priority category for asylum, fearing accusations of religious favoritism or diplomatic complications with Muslim countries. International Christian organizations work tirelessly to evacuate converts at risk, but face immense logistical obstacles: tightly controlled borders, escape routes dominated by unscrupulous human traffickers, and the absence of proper documentation for many Christians who have burned their papers for fear of being identified. How many of these abandoned believers think of empty Western churches as they risk their lives to pray in dark basements, silently questioning the global brotherhood that their faith promises? Afghanistan today represents a particularly painful case study of how international policies impact vulnerable religious communities. During 20 years of Western occupation, many Afghans were encouraged to adopt liberal values, including greater religious tolerance. Missionaries, although officially banned, operated with relative freedom in some regions, especially through humanitarian organizations with religious components. Christian satellite TV channels and online media became accessible, resulting in a small but significant conversion movement, mainly among educated, urban Afghans. When international support for the Afghan government collapsed abruptly, these new converts instantly became a priority target, seen as the product of Western cultural contamination. The speed with which they were abandoned raises deeply uncomfortable questions about moral responsibility. By promoting values of religious freedom in societies where such concepts entail existential risks, what subsequent obligations are created to protect those who embrace these values? Despite this apocalyptic scenario, extraordinary accounts of persistent faith emerge from the shadows of Afghanistan. A clandestine pastor in Kabul, communicating via encrypted messages, described how his congregation, before the fall, met in a house rented specifically for services. Now they have split into cells of 3 people who meet in apparently casual contexts, during walks in parks, shopping sessions in bazaars, or briefly in tea houses. At each meeting, they share memorized verses, encourage each other and pray together in almost inaudible whispers, always on guard against observers. "Our church has no walls, no ceiling, no pews," he wrote. "We exist in the spaces between words, in meaningful glances, in handshakes that last a second longer. It's a church made not of bricks, but of hearts connected by the invisible Spirit." This radical reimagining of what constitutes a church reveals the extraordinary adaptability of human faith, capable of finding expression even in the most hostile of environments. Afghanistan confronts us with an uncomfortable question. What is worth more, the comfort of practicing it openly or the inner certainty that persists even when every outward sign must be suppressed? For Western Christians, accustomed to public and institutionalized expressions of faith, the witness of Afghan Christians offers a radically different paradigm, a spirituality distilled to its purest essence, where every prayer is an act of resistance and on the eastern border of the Islamic world, born out of the traumatic partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, Pakistan has emerged as a nation defined by its religious identity. Created explicitly as a home for Muslims, this country of more than 220 million inhabitants is also home to a significant Christian population. Approximately 4 million people who mainly inhabit urban ghettos and marginalized rural communities. Unlike other countries that explicitly ban the Bible, Pakistan maintains a facade of religious freedom, with constitutional guarantees to protect minorities. However, behind this veneer of tolerance lies a legal and social system that has turned the lives of Christians into a nightmare of constant vulnerability. What does it mean to live in a country where a simple accusation, even without proof, can turn your life into hell on earth? At the heart of this systematic vulnerability are Pakistan's infamous blasphemy laws, particularly sections 295B and 295C of the Penal Code, introduced during the Islamization promoted by military dictator Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s. These laws criminalize any desecration of the Quran or insult to the Prophet Muhammad, with penalties that include life imprisonment and death. The most dangerous feature of these laws is not only their severity, but their extraordinary vagueness. They do not clearly define what constitutes blasphemy and do not require substantial evidence for charges. All it takes is an accusation, often without witnesses or material evidence, for the accused to face not only the judicial system, but the fury of mobs thirsty for religious justice. As a result, these laws have become lethal instruments in personal disputes, conflicts over land, or simply expressions of religious prejudice, with Christians being disproportionately targeted. For Pakistani Christians, possessing a Bible is not technically illegal, but it can easily be interpreted as evidence of proselytizing intent or as preparatory material for blasphemy. Police officers often confiscate Bibles during investigations, presenting them in court as offensive material. In conservative rural communities, where illiteracy is high and extremist interpretations of Islam prevalent, the simple act of a Christian reading his Bible publicly can be perceived as an affront to Islam. A Christian woman from Lahore described how she keeps her Bible hidden in a false compartment under the floor of her small house, only taking it out in the early hours of the morning when she is sure no neighbors can see it through the windows. "It's the only time I really feel in communion with God," she explained, "when everyone is asleep and I can hear His voice without fear." This reality of secret hiding places and furtive reading is not exceptional, but the everyday experience of millions of Christians in a country where religious fanaticism can turn neighbors into inquisitors overnight. The case of Asia Bibi has become emblematic of the tragedy faced by Pakistani Christians. This Christian woman, a mother of 5 and a farm laborer, was accused of blasphemy in 2009 after a trivial argument about drinking water from a communal well. Muslim colleagues claimed that, as she was impure because of her Christian faith, she had contaminated the water by touching it. In the heated discussion that followed, Asia allegedly made offensive comments about the Prophet Muhammad, a charge she has always vehemently denied. Without any proper investigation, she was arrested, tried and sentenced to death by hanging. For almost a decade, she languished on death row, separated from her children who grew up without a mother, suffering constant abuse from guards and other prisoners, while crowds outside the prison demanded her immediate execution. Her case generated international attention and, after countless appeals, she was finally acquitted by Pakistan's Supreme Court in 2018. In their decision, the judges emphasized the glaring inconsistencies in the testimonies against her and the total absence of material evidence. But even after her acquittal, Asia faced such intense death threats that she had to be secretly evacuated from the country. Today, she lives in exile in Canada, permanently separated from her homeland. Asia Bibi's case, far from being exceptional, illustrates a systematic pattern. Human rights organizations have documented hundreds of similar cases where Christians are falsely accused of blasphemy in retaliation for personal disputes, economic conflicts, or simply out of envy. Particularly vulnerable are Christians who occupy better positions than their Muslim neighbors, small business owners, landowners, or qualified professionals. The dynamic is sadly predictable. An accusation of blasphemy is made, crowds quickly form, the police arrest the accused for their own protection, and the judicial system moves with glacial slowness while the lives of the accused and their family are irreparably destroyed. Even when eventually acquitted, often after years or decades in prison, the accused are not allowed to return to their communities, where they continue to be seen as blasphemers deserving of death. What does this reveal about a system where the mere accusation amounts to a sentence, where the process becomes the punishment, and where legal innocence rarely restores destroyed lives? In addition to the formal accusations of blasphemy, Pakistani Christians face systematic collective violence. Entire Christian neighborhoods have been set on fire by angry mobs following rumors of desecration of the Quran. In 2009, 8 Christians, including a 4-year-old child, were burnt alive in Godhra when a mob attacked their homes following allegations that pages of the Quran had been desecrated at a Christian wedding. In 2013, more than 150 Christian homes in Lahore's Joseph Colony neighborhood were set on fire after a local Christian was accused of blasphemy. In 2015, a Christian couple were thrown alive into an industrial oven by a mob after rumors emerged that they had burned pages of Quranic verses. In none of these cases have the main instigators been adequately punished, creating a culture of impunity that normalizes anti-Christian violence. The police often refuse to intervene during such attacks, fearing being labeled anti-Islamic, or simply sharing the prejudices of the attackers. How can a minority find security in a system where those charged with protecting them often sympathize with their persecutors? Discrimination against Christians in Pakistan extends far beyond blasphemy laws, permeating every aspect of daily life. Approximately 80% of Pakistani Christians are relegated to professions considered impure by society: drain cleaners, rubbish collectors, street sweepers. These occupations, as well as being dangerous and poorly paid, carry a deep social stigma, reinforcing intergenerational cycles of poverty and exclusion. In public schools, Christian students often face systematic discrimination, from insults from teachers to teaching material that presents non-Muslims as inferior or enemies of the state. Access to higher education and public employment is severely limited by unofficial quotas and institutionalized prejudice. In public hospitals, Christian patients often receive inferior treatment, with documented cases of nurses refusing to touch Christian patients or using separate utensils to serve them, considering them unclean. How do you maintain human dignity when every social interaction reinforces the message that you are fundamentally less valuable than your compatriots? Particularly vulnerable are Christian women and girls, who face what human rights organizations describe as intersectional discrimination, oppressed simultaneously because of their religion and gender. Each year, an estimated 1,000 Christian and Hindu girls, some as young as 12, are kidnapped, forced to convert to Islam, and married off to their abductors. When families seek police help, they are often told that their daughters voluntarily converted and got married, presenting documents signed under coercion as proof. The courts regularly refuse to intervene, accepting testimonies from clearly traumatized and intimidated girls as evidence of genuine conversion. In a case documented in 2020, Arzu Raja, a 13-year-old Christian girl, was kidnapped in Karachi. When brought to court, the case was initially dismissed after the judge accepted the 44-year-old kidnapper's claim that she had freely converted and agreed to marriage, ignoring documentary evidence of her age. Only after intense public pressure was the case reopened, a rare exception in a systematic pattern of injustice. What does this reveal about a justice system that regularly fails to protect its most vulnerable citizens? In response to these brutal realities, the Pakistani Christian community has developed extraordinary systems of surveillance and mutual protection. Churches in sensitive areas are surrounded by concrete barriers and checkpoints, with armed volunteers guarding entrances during services. Larger congregations invest in metal detectors and training for security teams who develop detailed evacuation plans. During important celebrations such as Christmas and Easter, when attacks are more likely, many families choose not to attend services or split up between different churches to ensure that, in the event of an attack, the family is not entirely wiped out. Christian schools operate under security similar to that of military installations. This permanent state of alert turns religious practice, ideally a moment of peace and transcendence, into an experience fraught with anxiety and fear. How can you genuinely experience the sacred when you're constantly on alert for physical threats? Yet in the midst of this seemingly impenetrable darkness, the Pakistani Christian community not only survives, but occasionally flourishes in surprising ways. In Lahore, a choir of young Christians from a poor community has gained national recognition by singing both Christian hymns and Muslim Sufi songs, building cultural bridges through music. In hospitals founded by Christian missions in the 19th century, Christian doctors and nurses continue to serve patients of all religions, living a silent testimony of unconditional love. In universities, small but persistent groups of Christian students organize interfaith dialogues, challenging hateful narratives with extraordinary courage. And in the depths of marginalized communities, pastors and lay leaders educate a new generation, combining unwavering faith with activism for the rights of their community. These initiatives, rarely reported and often developed under enormous pressure, reveal a community that refuses to be defined only by its oppression. Isn't this ability to create beauty and meaning in the midst of suffering one of the most profound indicators of the resilience of the human spirit? The situation of Christians in Pakistan confronts us with disturbing questions about the nature of religious tolerance and the moral foundations of the international community. How can the world simultaneously celebrate universal declarations of human rights and maintain normal diplomatic and trade relations with countries that systematically violate these same rights? What responsibility do influential nations have to press for reforms when religious minorities face systematic persecution? And perhaps most importantly, what lessons can we learn from faith communities that, even under relentless oppression, maintain not only their religious identity, but also their fundamental humanity, refusing to mirror the hatred of their oppressors and continuing to believe in the possibility of a more just world? Perhaps the most powerful testimony of Pakistani Christians is not simply their perseverance in faith, but their persistent ability to dream of and work for a country where religious differences are respected and where the dignity of every person is recognized, regardless of their belief. In an increasingly polarized and intolerant world, this witness transcends religious boundaries, speaking to universally human aspirations for dignity, recognition, and peace. In ancient Persia, the cradle of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, stands the Islamic Republic of Iran, a nation with a glorious past and the theocratic present coexist in tense contradiction. The land of mystical poets like Rumi and Hafez, whose verses celebrated union with the divine beyond rigid dogma, contemporary Iran has become a state where religious expression is strictly controlled and where the Christian faith, present in the region since the first centuries after Christ, survives only in the shadows of clandestinity. How did a country that was once a model of cultural sophistication and religious tolerance turn into one of the most systematic persecutors of Christians in the contemporary world? Iran's modern history was irrevocably altered by the Islamic Revolution of 1979, when popular demonstrations against the pro-Western regime of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi culminated in the rise of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the establishment of a Shiite theocracy. This revolution was not just a political change, but a fundamental transformation in the very identity of the country. The new regime instituted a system of Vilayat-e-Faqih, rule of the Islamic jurist, in which the supreme leader, a Shiite cleric, holds ultimate authority over all aspects of public and private life. In this system, Islamic law is not just a source of legislation, but the very foundation of the state, and religious conformity becomes a matter of national security. For the Iranian regime, Christianity represents not just a different faith, but an ideological threat associated with Western imperialism and a potential source of dissent in a society that demands uniformity of belief and practice. The persecution of Christians in Iran takes different forms depending on the ethnic and historical origins of the communities. The so-called traditional or ethnic churches, Armenian and Assyrian, present in the country for centuries, receive limited legal recognition and can practice their faith under severe restrictions. They cannot evangelize, must conduct services only in their ethnic languages, not in Farsi, the national language, and face systematic discrimination in education and employment. For these historic Christians, life is one of constant marginalization, but rarely of immediate danger. Radically different is the situation of converts from Islam to Christianity, the so-called ex-Muslim Christians, who face active and systematic persecution. For the Iranian regime, the conversion of a Muslim is interpreted as apostasy, a crime punishable by death according to traditional interpretations of the Sharia, although Iran rarely formally applies this penalty to avoid international condemnation. Can you imagine the psychological reality of a person whose simple change of inner faith is considered a capital offense by the state? The Iranian government's strategy against evangelistic Christianity is meticulously calculated. Instead of public executions that would generate negative international attention, the regime employs a sophisticated system of intimidation, surveillance, and administrative punishment. The Ministry of Intelligence, in coordination with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, maintains extensive networks of informants in every town and village, closely monitoring any suspicious activity. Converts often report that their phone lines are tapped, their emails monitored, and their movements tracked. When authorities identify a potential Christian leader or an active house church, the response usually follows a pattern: house raids during prayer meetings, confiscation of Bibles and Christian literature, intensive interrogations, and, finally, vague but serious accusations of propaganda against the state or actions against national security. These apparently political charges allow the regime to deny that it is persecuting people for religious reasons, while effectively criminalizing the practice of evangelistic Christianity. How can you defend yourself when your real crime, your faith, is hidden under layers of fabricated political accusations? For Iranian Christians, owning a Bible has become an act of extraordinary courage. Although it is not technically illegal to possess a Bible for personal study, any amount that suggests distribution or group use is considered evidence of illegal missionary activity. The authorities regularly confiscate and destroy Bibles found during raids, particularly those in Farsi, the national language. In 2011, the Iranian government ordered the printing of only 5,000 Bibles in the country, absurdly insufficient for a population of 83 million, stating that this quantity would be adequate for the needs of legally recognized Christian minorities. At the same time, customs officials were instructed to confiscate Farsi Bibles at all points of entry into the country. Christian converts often share a single Bible between several believers, photographing pages with smartphones for individual study, or memorizing lengthy passages as a precaution against searches. One underground pastor described how his 18-strong congregation shared 2 Bibles, with members receiving them for a week each in continuous rotation. "Our greatest blessing," he explained, "is when someone manages to bring a new Bible to our community. We treat it as a treasure more valuable than gold." The case of Pastor Youssef Nadarkhani exemplifies the brutal persecution faced by Christian leaders in Iran. Converted to Christianity at the age of 19, Nadarkhani became a pastor in Rasht, leading a congregation of the Church of Iran, an indigenous Protestant denomination. In 2009, he was arrested after protesting against compulsory Islamic religious education for Christian children. Initially accused of apostasy and sentenced to death, his case sparked international outrage. After 3 years in prison and significant diplomatic pressure, the charge was changed to evangelizing Muslims, and his sentence reduced to 3 years. Released in 2012, he was arrested again in 2018 on charges of promoting Zionist Christianity, and is currently serving a 10-year sentence in inhumane conditions in Tehran's notorious Evin prison, known for the systematic torture of political and religious prisoners. During his time in prison, he was repeatedly pressurized to renounce his faith in exchange for immediate freedom, an offer he consistently rejected. His wife was also arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison, leaving the couple's children essentially orphaned by living parents. The Nadarkhani case is no aberration, but it exemplifies a systematic pattern against prominent Christian leaders. What is the impact on Christian communities when their pastors are systematically removed from social contact? House churches represent both the greatest expression of Christian resistance in Iran and the main target of government repression. Since 2010, when the last churches in Farsi were forced to close, these small congregations that meet in private homes have become the only option for converts to practice their faith. Typically consisting of 8 to 15 people, these clandestine communities adopt extraordinary security measures. Members arrive and leave individually at staggered times, windows are covered, music is played only in whispers, and mobile phones are switched off or left in another room to avoid monitoring. Meeting places are constantly rotated, and new members are only accepted after an extensive period of observation and introduction by existing members. Even so, these churches are regularly discovered through the government's extensive network of informants. In December 2018, in a single coordinated operation during the Christmas celebrations, more than 150 Christians were arrested in several Iranian cities, with dozens receiving lengthy prison sentences. How can a community of faith be kept alive when each gathering could be the last before prison? The Iranian regime complements its physical repression with sophisticated strategies of social and psychological control. Converts often lose their jobs after their faith becomes known, inadvertently finding themselves blacklisted by state and private employers. Christian students are expelled from universities or prevented from advancing academically. The children of converts face systematic bullying in schools and are forced to take part in Islamic religious education. When arrested, Christians often face pressure to provide information about other believers in exchange for more lenient treatment. The authorities deliberately isolate converts from their support networks, creating a climate of mistrust within Christian communities. Particularly cruel is the practice of demanding exorbitant bail for the release of detained Christians, often equivalent to the total value of a house, forcing families to hand over deeds to their homes as collateral and effectively holding them as financial hostages to guarantee good behavior upon release. This multifaceted approach aims not only to punish individual Christians, but to systematically destroy the community structures that sustain the Christian faith. What kind of inner resilience does it take to keep the faith when every aspect of your social and material life is under attack? Surprisingly, despite this systematic persecution, or perhaps partly because of it, Christianity is the fastest-growing religion in contemporary Iran. Conservative estimates suggest that there are between 800,000 and 1 million Christians in the country, most of whom have converted in the last 2 decades, representing an extraordinary growth from the approximately 500 known converts before the Islamic Revolution. This apparent paradox has multiple explanations. Firstly, widespread disillusionment with Islamic theocracy, particularly among educated urban youth, has created an opening for spiritual alternatives. Secondly, digital globalization has allowed Iranians to access information about Christianity through satellite channels such as SAT-7 and Mohabbat TV, which broadcast Christian programming in Farsi throughout the region. Thirdly, the global Iranian diaspora has created transnational networks that facilitate the flow of resources and religious knowledge. Finally, many converts report significant spiritual experiences, visions, dreams, and sensations of inner peace, which they interpret as direct divine communication in a context where access to physical Christian communities is severely limited. Isn't it deeply ironic that a regime that has devoted enormous resources to eradicating Christianity is inadvertently witnessing its exponential growth? Contemporary Iranian Christianity has developed distinctive characteristics shaped by its context of persecution. Devoid of formal ecclesiastical structures, traditional hierarchies, or dedicated buildings, it has become an extraordinarily decentralized, adaptable, and resilient movement. Leadership is often shared, with multiple people developing different aspects of ministry to minimize the impact should any individual be arrested. Theology is markedly focused on themes of suffering, perseverance, and eschatological hope, with deep identification with the persecuted early church described in the New Testament. Practices such as baptism, traditionally a public ritual, are reinterpreted for clandestine contexts, performed in bathtubs at midnight or in remote private pools. Communion/Eucharist celebrations are conducted with ordinary grape juice and homemade bread. This complete reimagining of Christianity under pressure reveals the extraordinary adaptability of the human faith, capable of preserving its essence while radically transforming its external expressions. Aren't we witnessing, in contemporary Iran, a form of Christianity surprisingly similar to that practiced in the first centuries, before the institutionalization of the church? Maryam, name changed, was a university student in Tehran when she encountered Christianity through a classmate. Particularly fascinated by the figure of Jesus as presented in the Gospels, she secretly began attending a small house church. For almost a year, she led a double life, outwardly conforming to Islamic expectations, inwardly embracing her new faith. When authorities raided a prayer meeting, Maryam was arrested along with 12 other Christians. During 3 weeks of intensive interrogation, she was kept in solitary confinement, deprived of sleep, and repeatedly threatened. Interrogators showed her photographs of her parents, informing her that they too would be arrested if she didn't cooperate by identifying other Christians. Under extreme psychological pressure, Maryam finally signed a declaration renouncing Christianity and pledging not to take part in Christian activities. Released on exorbitant bail, she fell into a deep depression, devastated by her perceived betrayal of Christ. It was through secret contact with other believers that she gradually understood the concept of grace and forgiveness, eventually reconnecting with her faith. Today, she attends a different house church, using her experience to advise other Christians on how to face interrogations. "I learnt that even in our weakness, God doesn't abandon us," she reflects. "My denial, like Peter's, became part of my testimony of his unwavering faithfulness." The persecution of Christians in Iran reveals the fundamental contradictions of a regime that simultaneously seeks international legitimacy and maintains medieval domestic policies. The country is a signatory to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which explicitly protects the right to change religion, while in practice criminalizing precisely this right. Officially, the Iranian government denies persecuting religious minorities, claiming that it only punishes illegal activities against national security, a claim contradicted by extensive documentation from human rights organizations that demonstrates the explicitly religious focus of the persecutions. This duplicity reappears in the regime's response to international pressure, periodically releasing some known Christian prisoners ahead of important diplomatic visits or economic negotiations, while simultaneously arresting others away from the media spotlight. This game of appearances reveals the fundamentally insecure nature of the theocratic regime, sufficiently concerned with its international image to avoid the most visible forms of religious persecution, but unable to abandon its fundamental repression of any independent religious expression. Isn't this tension between appearance and reality a defining characteristic of authoritarian regimes in our age of global connectivity? The phenomenon of underground Christianity in Iran raises profound questions about the nature of faith in conditions of extreme adversity. For many Western observers, accustomed to associating Christianity with visible institutions, established traditions and public expressions of devotion, Iranian Christianity represents a radically different paradigm, a faith defined not by its external structures, but by inner conviction and intimate interpersonal communion. When deprived of almost all the traditional elements of Christian practice, dedicated buildings, professional clergy, elaborate rituals, freedom of expression, these believers have distilled their religion to its most fundamental essence: the personal relationship with God and the sacrificial communion between believers. An exiled Iranian pastor said, "In prison, when they took everything away from me, my Bible, my freedom, my basic human dignity, I discovered the meaning of Paul's phrase, 'For to me to live is Christ.' When Christ is all you have, you discover that Christ is all you need." This rediscovery of primitive Christianity, stripped of historical and cultural accumulations, offers a provocative mirror for Christians in free societies, inviting them to reconsider what constitutes the irreducible core of their faith. Are these persecuted Christians not, paradoxically, more free in their spiritual expression than many in societies where religion has become comfortably institutionalized? The persistence of Christianity in Iran, against all odds and facing systematic opposition, testifies to something deeply significant about the nature of human spiritual yearning. In a country where the regime has spent 4 decades trying to impose religious uniformity through massive propaganda, doctrinaire education, and severe punishment, thousands continue to risk everything for a different faith. This phenomenon challenges purely materialistic or political narratives, suggesting that the human quest for transcendent meaning cannot be eliminated through external coercion. For a regime founded on the premise that religion can and should be controlled by the state, the persistence of independent faith communities represents an existential challenge. Perhaps this is the real threat that Christianity and other independent religious expressions pose to totalitarian regimes: the affirmation that there is a dimension of human experience that transcends state control, an inner space where even the most oppressed prisoner can experience a form of freedom that no jailer can remove. And isn't it this possibility of transcendence, this affirmation of the inalienable spiritual dignity of the human person, that remains the most fundamental challenge to all forms of totalitarianism, whether religious or secular? For those of us who live in societies where religious freedom is guaranteed, these stories serve as a powerful call to reflection and gratitude. How often do we take for granted the privilege of freely opening our Bibles, attending places of worship without fear, or publicly expressing our deepest convictions? When we learn about the extraordinary sacrifices our brothers and sisters make for the right to simply possess the Scriptures, we are invited to reconsider the value we place on our own spiritual freedom. Perhaps the most important legacy of these persecuted Christians is the reminder that true faith is never merely cultural or convenient. It is a conscious choice that, in its purest expression, transcends comfort, security, and even self-preservation. In a world where deep convictions are often sacrificed on the altar of convenience, their testimony challenges us to rediscover the meaning of authentic fidelity and the transformative power of a faith that persists even when all else is lost. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I've specially selected for you some videos full of profound insights and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step towards transforming your reality.